Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Jess Flanigan, and we're going to talk about pharmaceutical freedom, the patient's right to self medicate. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right. So, you wrote a book, a really fascinating book, in my opinion, about the patient's right to self medicate. If I remember correctly, the position that you're taking is that people shouldn't need a prescription in order to access medications. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. Can you give kind of like a quick summary of the argument in the book?
Sure. So, in most kind of advanced economies that regulate the sale of pharmaceuticals, there's two barriers that people face for accessing the kinds of drugs we would think of as therapeutics, medicine. The first is pre market approval requirements. So, the company needs to get a permission slip from the government to certify that they're allowed to sell it on the market. And then once they have that permission slip, every patient needs to get a permission slip from their doctor in order to be able to buy the drug. And my argument is that public officials, people in the government, do not have the authority to require permission slips for someone to sell a pharmaceutical, to sell medicines to people. And they don't have the authority to require that doctors hand out permission slips in order for people to be able to make decisions about their own health and bodies. And the high level argument is think about when you go to the doctor, if the doctor says, you know what, I think that you should start taking cholesterol medicine, or I think that maybe you should take metformin because you're pre-diabetic or something like that. And then you say, yeah, I'm not going to take that because even if it's in my medical interest, I don't want to have to remember to take a pill every day. I don't want to deal with side effects, whatever. I'm the expert about my overall interest and it's my body. I get to decide I'm not going to take that drug. The doctrine of informed consent, which we all, I hope, agree with, says it would be really wrong for the doctor to coerce or force or trick you into taking a drug against your will. But if you go to the doctor and say, I want to try cholesterol medicine, or I think that maybe I want to try metformin for weight loss to like prevent diabetes or for longevity reasons or whatever, the doctor can prevent you from accessing those kinds of drugs if the doctor doesn't think that it's a good idea for you to take them. But the same reason that the doctor didn't have the authority to force you to take those drugs is the same reason that says the doctor doesn't have the authority to prevent you from taking those drugs. You're the expert about your overall well-being. And in any case, it's your body. So you're the person who should get to decide what happens to it. That's kind of the high level. No permission slips argument.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So then what do you say in response to the people who make a distinction between the right to refuse and the right to demand?
Well, the right to refuse is often cashed out in terms of, well, I have a right against being coerced or against being treated with violent threats, or I have a bodily right against interference in some way. But if we think about informed consent, it's not always those types of situations. For example, a person can violate your refusal rights if they deceive you, if they withhold relevant information and prevent you that way. Even if they never pass the boundary of your physical body, if they just trick you by telling you that, declining to take a drug voluntarily will have outcomes that are not true, for example, something like that. If there's deception in medicine or someone withholds a diagnosis, so you don't have full information about your body, but you think you do. Those types of violations also are inconsistent with the idea of informed consent, that every patient should have the authority to be the person who decides what happens to their own body. And that's not going to be a right against bodily force or interference. At the same time, the laws that require that you get a permission slip from your doctor, they actually are enforced with violent threats. They're coercively enforced. So accessing drugs through diversion on the gray market or the black market have criminal penalties attached to them. People who distribute drugs to people who don't have these prescriptions, who don't have a permission slip, the distributors of those drugs can also be subject to criminal penalties. If manufacturers sell drugs without authorization or advertise about their drugs, they can have their property confiscated. They can lose their rights to sell other drugs in the marketplace. All of these policies are enforced through licensing requirements and regulations that are backed by the coercive power of lawmakers. So there are violent and coercive threats lurking in the background of pharmaceutical regulations that we don't really notice. And there are a lot of ways that we already recognize that your bodily rights to make decisions about your own health can be violated, even if nobody ever physically assaults you or commits medical battery.
Mhm. So the 2 parts that you discussed in the beginning, like the permission slip that companies need to get from the government to, like, market and manufacture and market drugs, and then the permission slip that doctors need to give, patients in order to take these drugs. It sounds like what you're saying is that the kinda like the fundamental value is patient autonomy, right? People should have the right to decide what is best for them because they are the experts on themselves. So then the argument against requiring these permission slips, f for, these companies to manufacture and market these drugs also stems from that, right?
I think it's both ways. Yeah. I mean, I think that the manufacturers have an entitlement to be able to make this available to people, and also people have an entitlement to access it. So there we might think of an analogy to free speech. Free speech is great because it's great for people to be able to offer up their opinions and views on things, and then it's also great for the listeners to be able to hear all of these different opinions and views and have all these different options. Pharmaceutical freedom is good because it's great for producers to be able to offer up products that they think could benefit people and have these mutually beneficial markets happening in medicine. And it's great for patients to be able to have access to whatever options they think are important for them to have. Now, the argument that you characterized, it's sort of like you said, oh, it's like autonomy plus expertise. Yeah, the structure of the argument is kind of nested. Like the thing I truly believe is that this is a rights-based argument. And so, like, it doesn't even matter if, like, you're the expert about your overall well-being or if you're right about your health. It's your body, and I think that you should be able to have the decision to decide what medicine to take in the same way you have the right to decide what medicine to refuse. But not everybody believes in rights, and so as a secondary argument, I say, even if you're not, like, a rights person, the thing we should really care about is a person's overall well-being, and there's no reason to think that some regulator at the FDA or some doctor who barely knows you and sees you twice a year is gonna be more of an expert about what's good for your life as a whole than you are. But then I say, but even if you don't care about that, and maybe you think, no, no, all we should care about is health outcomes. Even then, we've learned from our collective experience of giving people more rights of informed consent that there's good medical benefits to letting people be in the driver's seat when it comes to their own health on balance, not for everybody, but at a population level. And so there could be medical benefits to permitting self-medication rights as well for same reasons. So it's kind of a nested argument where it's like the strongest one is the one I believe, but everybody should have reason to reconsider the current system, even if they don't believe in rights of self-medication the way I do.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to kind of the approach that you're taking. Like I'm generally sympathetic to some sort of rights-based argument. I think a lot of people do think that we have like fundamental rights. So that is not contingent on us being experts over our
And yeah,
well-being, right? It's totally compatible with us being wrong most of the time, or even all the
yeah,
time about what's good for us, right? And I think people, I mean, everyone's willing to admit that people will make dumb decisions and unwise decisions. Okay, but then you're saying, all right, well, let's say you don't, for some reason, you don't believe in rights. There's some sort of utilitarian argument that you
mhm,
can provide as well, right? Just like
right,
overall on a population level, it just turns out that it's better for people to have the freedom to be able to decide which medications to take.
right. And not saying that everybody's an expert about medicine, but a lot of people are probably in the position that I am in, where they're experts about their life as a whole and all their values in general. And they are also pretty well placed to figure out if there's a decision that's a little bit beyond their capacities. And so I know a lot about cars. And so when something's up with my car, I'll take it to a mechanic because I know that I don't know that much about it. And so I just want to like put that domain of decision making in someone else's hands. But like, somebody might know about cars and they might be well placed and well equipped to make those decisions for themselves. So it shouldn't be required that like nobody's allowed to fix their own car. Similarly, you might think like, well, we all know people who are terrible decision makers in life in general, about like what's good for them, in some kind of domain. But like romantic choices, for example. But it would be a mistake to say, look at people. They're so bad at making decisions in that domain. That's why, therefore, they shouldn't have the right to make the decisions because there's an additional welfare hit that a person might suffer from not having the right to make those decisions, even if they themselves are pretty bad at it. And so, like, if you know somebody who has like terrible taste in men, that might be true that like she's actually like not good at choosing a partner who's good for her. But it might also be the case that a world in which she didn't have the ability to choose what partner was good for her because like her parents were screening all of her online dating matches or something, that would be much worse, even if she's legit bad. And so when I say like people are generally the experts about their well-being, I mean they're generally in a better position to know what's good for their life as a whole than anyone else. But even if they're not in the, a more reliable person in that domain, there's this additional harm of taking away that choice that we have to factor in. And so it's kind of the mid-level consequentialist argument about how people's lives as a whole are going to go better if we let them have authority over these decisions because they can always outsource it. So I say, like, if you love your doctor writing you a permission slip, if you love the FDA, keep it. Like, I don't think that anybody should be stopped from asking a doctor for advice or looking to a government official for certification or, some kind of stamp of approval for a thing that they think is safe and effective. I don't think any of that should have to go away. But for the people who disagree, I don't think they should be required to follow those guidelines.
Yeah, yeah. No, I have like 10 different thoughts swirling around at the same time. So one, I think common objection that you've probably received is coming from a like a pessimistic type of perspective. It's like, no, people are really dumb. Like, you can't give people this. People should not have this freedom. People are going to kill themselves accidentally. They're going to accidentally kill other people too. Like, we need some sort of paternalistic government because even though we may be experts over our own lives, there are just certain things that are maybe a little too consequential to just leave up to the individual to decide. Like, we need some sort of regulation. So there's skepticism, like in terms of like the individual ability to kind of make these decisions, but I think there's also skepticism like against like big pharma and like their
Yeah,
motivations, right? And so we need kind of like this countering force to regulate big pharma.
totally. Yeah. So I totally concede that in a free society, like people will sometimes die. Like a free society that has rights to own firearms, yeah, like people will die from firearms, which they wouldn't have died from firearms if they lived in a society that didn't have those rights. There's a debate about like how much excess death is attributable to giving people the right to go base jumping or own guns or to make other sorts of dangerous choices. There's probably some, I can see that. And if you make something legal, it's more likely that people will do it. And so I so I do think that people who are defending rights to do dangerous things, they should accept the fact that like, yeah, it could be that if you make it permissible for people to do dangerous stuff, more people might do dangerous stuff and they could be hurt by it. Um, that said, I do think that we sometimes overstate it because if people aren't used to exercising that freedom, they have a kind of learned helplessness. And so they might seem like they're less capable than they actually are. So before women had property rights, people were very worried about giving women property rights because they said, look at how women spend their money. They spend it on like dresses and like dumb stuff. But that was because women had never had any incentive or reason to develop financial literacy because their husbands had full property rights over all the family property. But then when women did have some real skin in the game and they did have stakes, they were totally capable of financial literacy and they didn't have a reason to develop that ability when they lacked that freedom all along. And people said this about giving people rights of informed consent. So in the late 1960s, they did surveys of physicians about what would happen if you told people, for example, the truth of their diagnosis. An oncologist in one survey at a rate of 90% said that they would sometimes lie to patients about their cancer diagnosis or even substitute in an alternative diagnosis. And their reasoning was that it would be really, really harmful for patients to hear that bad news and that patients would make really bad decisions. Like they might spend all their money or gamble or jump out the window, or they're very worried that if a person found out that they had cancer, that knowing what was happening with their own body would be bad for them. It turned out that that wasn't true. So we speculated that giving people medical autonomy would be bad for them in the past. And then we were wrong about it. It turned out that the anxiety and the feeling of helplessness of not knowing what was happening with your body was actually very harmful for a person. And it was better for them to understand what their prognosis was and be able to plan around it. So it's not clear to me that giving people medical freedom would necessarily, in a lot of these cases, be as bad as we think it is because people might have learned helplessness and we might be overstating the negative outcomes while understating the positive outcomes. But there are other kinds of contexts like drugs and guns where yeah, if you legalize stuff, you might see higher rates of overdosing for drugs or suicide for guns, things like that. Um, and then I'm just say like, yeah, as long as the people are consenting and they're fully informed, then I think that that's a acceptable price to pay for everybody else having the freedom to make decisions about their bodies. Now you say to that, well, are they consenting and are they fully conformed? Because like informed, because big pharma is like so flawed. So like people are like so unreliable, such bad decision makers. Have you met them? So easily manipulated. And then there's this like, huge pharmaceutical industry that's putting their thumb on the scales. Totally. First of all, I don't think big pharma should necessarily be vilified that much because this is a whole industry that makes its money by curing diseases and helping people live longer. So I don't really understand why people are so accepting of like hating on big pharma. Of all of the ways to make money, like curing diseases and helping people live happier, longer lives seems like a great way to make money. And I want there to be a lot of money in that. I hope that people get super rich curing diseases and helping people live happier, longer lives. But when you say like, and that's a reason for regulation, even if you are skeptical of pharma, people in government are also flawed people who are capable of biases and making mistakes, and they have their own incentives. And regulators have an incentive to minimize drug disasters as much as possible by being excessively risk averse. Because when everybody dies of drug delay or when new cures aren't invented because they're in a highly regulated space and there's no financial incentive for a drug maker to enter into that market because the regulatory burden is so high, it just can't be profitable or it's unlikely to be profitable. No one sees the people who are dying from those regulations. But when a dangerous drug hits the market, they will look to the regulators and they'll blame the FDA and they'll call for more congressional oversight of these regulatory bodies. And that means that public officials have very strong incentives to kill people with regulatory delay, which they're not going to be blamed with, or they're not going to be blamed for that. And then to be so excessively cautious about preventing drug deaths and drug disasters that on balance, they could be doing more harm than good because they're also flawed and biased decision makers who have their own unreliable motivations.
Yeah,
Not that they're bad people, but just like structurally, like they're structurally in a position that's going to prompt them to overstate the harms of a drug disaster and understate the harms of regulation.
yeah, I think that's a good point because, like, I think some people would say, well, institutionally, maybe the individuals who work in big pharma want to cure these diseases, but because they're just driven by profit, that they may, fudge the data here and there. They may say, "Oh no, opiates aren't addictive. You should prescribe them to your patients." And then it's like, "Oops," you know. So I think because we are familiar with and have seen scenes of people just, ODing on the sidewalk. I don't know if you've seen footage of Kensington, but it's like an open air drug market. And, I think but they're taking, it's called Trank or something. And it's really scary, just like seeing footage of that, just all these people on the sidewalk and they're passed out. Um, it really does, I think, make people skeptical of at least as your argument to the extent that you're arguing that people should have access to these drugs.
Yeah, no, I get that. I mean, one thing I was wrong about since pharmaceutical freedom happened is I was much more like, oh, like the problem with drugs, like with recreational drugs, people using recreational drugs. A lot of those problems are attributable to the fact that there's criminal penalties and it's a black market. And I still think that's somewhat true. Like I think like for example with fentanyl, like if it were possible for people to access clean, reliable opioids, I think you'd see fewer accidental fentanyl deaths. But I do think like some people are taking fentanyl because they want to, because like that's getting my. And I think that I had really underestimated when I was writing this earlier how many overdose deaths and how many like negative public externalities would be associated with drug legalization. And like, yeah, I just didn't see it coming. I thought that the Portugal data was going to be more representative of what would happen in places like Oregon, and like that was not true. Like we did not have the public health infrastructure and the kind of broader way of rolling out drug decriminalization that could make us so that we had the same kinds of outcomes Portugal, and I think we have a different underlying population. And so just kind of a different set of problems. So I do feel the force of that. On the other hand, I don't know that that's a reason for criminalization anyhow, partly because I think that what addiction is not really about the drugs. I think like the people who use drugs often are using it voluntarily. Like though it's addictive behavior, it is the kind of decision that they are consenting to. They're making a decision about risks. They're making it that's maybe the best way that they can spend $30. That's like their best option given their broader circumstances. And so I don't think that you help those people by prohibiting the drugs or criminalizing them. I think sometimes prohibiting it and criminalizing can make it less safe. But I do think that it is like a really good objection to my view that like the number of people it turns out that are going to be using these drugs in a really harmful way is likely to increase. But we did see this with prohibition. Like you prohibit alcohol and the number of people who are using alcohol in a really damaging way, drinking away their paychecks, driving while intoxicated, beating their wives, whatever prohibition was about, that'll go down. Fewer people will drink. But there's like a lot of harm to everybody else of prohibiting alcohol. And there were a lot of other bad things associated with alcohol prohibition that made it so that on balance, it was still good to let people have access to alcohol. But we should be clear-eyed that there are a lot of social harms to alcohol, and the people who wanted prohibition were not wrong about those social harms. I think they were just wrong about the trade-off.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And if you're making a rights-based argument, then I mean these negative consequences just wouldn't really bother you, right? Like if you really just like taking this like staunch libertarian stance, then the fact that like 10% of people maybe like abuse drugs and end up ODing, that would be like, oh yeah, well that's just a consequence of living in a free society.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think that I think what I was addressing it was people who think that sometimes if a person's addicted that they can't really consent, and so, like, they're not giving valid consent to use their drug of choice, and I think that drug addicts my read of the psychology of addiction is that drug addicts are capable of consenting with respect to their decision to use their drug of choice, not just before they become addicted, but while they're addicted. Like, while regular drug users, they're capable of consenting, and here's how we can see that's true. When the criminal penalties associated with drug use go up, a bunch of people quit. When people age into their 30s, start having kids, other stuff's going on, a lot of them get clean. Um, if you nicotine is crazy addictive, like nicotine's such an addictive drug, but when you raise the price of nicotine, a lot of people quit. People are capable of quitting in response to incentives. And so when people aren't quitting, I think that we should hold it to the same kind of logic, which is that they're doing it because they could do otherwise, but it's very difficult for them to do otherwise. They have a very strong appetite of desire for the thing that they're addicted to.
Yeah, I feel like that would be a core part of this argument, right? Because if the psychological literature could show that maybe there was something special about addiction, that
Yeah.
actually people's autonomy were being violated and they
Yeah.
weren't being able to consent, then that would be you know, a libertarian argument to regulate these addictive substances.
Yeah, I mean, even then, I think the kind of standard libertarian view would be that people can consent to get into that position in the first place, knowing the risk. Um, but then there's this question of like, if it made you as if you were a small child or as if you were a mentally incapacitated person or something, then maybe there would be a different kind of justification for paternalism because you didn't have autonomous capacity in those cases. I don't think that that's true. I think people who are regular substance users, neurochemically, what's going on in their brain, it's very similar to other people who are acting on their strong appetite of desires. It's just that they desire something that's very bad for their health.
What I found interesting about your argument is that you took some time to talk about assisted suicide drugs, right? And that's actually the reason why I started reading your book is because I'm interested in physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. And if I remember your position correctly, is you think that they should be behind the counter. You shouldn't require a prescription, but they should be behind the counter because the pharmacist needs to assess the patient's decision-making capacity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I know I'm open to that. Yeah, I think like that's just because there are some of these cases where a person might legitimately like be in a mental state, like they're while they're intoxicated, for example, where they're like not capable of giving consent to this irreversible type of decision. And so, or people who are have some other kind of like very severe intellectual disability where they can't really understand what those decisions are. You might worry that they're being coerced or manipulated in some way. And it's like such a huge decision that you might want to have like a little bit more of a check in the same way that we have a bit of a check for a person buying a gun. Like, I don't love having background checks and all that, but like, I don't know, maybe have like a person behind the counter look at, just make sure that this person's of sound mind at at that moment. I think that that could be a kind of moderate policy solution that'd be okay. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's weird, like, when I think about your argument, I am conflicted, you know? Like, I do have libertarian leanings, I am, I'm a rights guy, I'm like, "Yeah, there's just certain fundamental rights that I think people have," and I think there are gonna be certain consequences that any libertarian-leaning person is just going to have to accept, but then I just think about these negative consequences and all these people ODing on the street, and I was just like, "Oh my goodness, like, this is terrible." Like, and maybe we can get a little bit into more of, like, the details here because you briefly mentioned Portugal and then Oregon. So, like, for, like, the listeners who may not know what they did in Portugal, can you explain that?
So Portugal decriminalized drugs so that being caught with possession without intent, like for user-based possession, didn't carry any criminal penalties. However, it still was the kind of thing that you could be ticketed with and have a kind of pretext for government intervention where they would put you in contact with people for like addiction counseling, substance use disorder support, things like that. Kind of honestly how we approach gambling in America now, where people say, like, "If you have a problem, like, we're gonna try to flag you," like, it kind of comes up on the gambling acts, like, "Oh, this might be problematic for you." Try to getting people into treatment to sort of help them if they have a higher order desire to stop acting on these first order desires to use their drug of choice, help them kind of maintain sobriety or find a path to sobriety with community support or, like, job support, like, a lot of kind of public health infrastructure behind it for that population. And also in Portugal, which I had not appreciated, people tend to kind of live in their communities for longer. There's, like, less, kind of a transient population that is kind of migrating from place to place, and so it was more feasible to have that kind of community support as a public health intervention for drug users. Now across the United States, we've seen decriminalization of a lot of different drugs. It's not gone that way. People will move to those cities for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they'll stay there, because they have more easy access to their drugs of choice. They'll form communities of other drug users. It becomes like a really big part of their identity. The criminal justice system that we have, when they do commit crimes that are associated with drug use but are unrelated to drugs because those drugs have been decriminalized, sometimes our criminal justice system will keep people close to the other people that they were using with, and so it's just, like, very difficult for a person to kind of detach themselves from that social identity and kind of form a different kind of community, and so there's just kind of a lot of, like, social differences. There's not as much religiosity in those areas that have been decriminalizing drugs, maybe that's a factor. So, I mean, people speculate, like, why has decriminalization gone different in America? There's a lot of stuff about America also in terms of, like, public health that is sort of a puzzle. Like, one thought is that maybe the American population, one of the things that makes us really great and economically productive also makes us, like, a kind of a public health nightmare, which is that Americans are kind of less conscientious and more risk accepting culturally, and so, like, maybe that's what's going on. I don't know what's happening here because I mean, there's just a lot of different factors, but it has not been, as we thought it would be, I think. I think that the effects of decriminalization have had substantially more overdose deaths and crime than people thought was gonna happen.
But that's just a consequence that you would have to accept if you're, like, a libertarian, right?
Not really. I mean, I don't think we should have to accept the crime, right? Like, it's like if
Yeah,
people
well, you would fight crime, but
stealing cars or whatever, like, that's bad for people's property rights. The overdose deaths are tricky because, like, I don't think that a libertarian should just be like, "Well, in a free society, people are gonna die. We just have to, like, accept it." I mean, I think that it's still plausible that it's a thing that you wanna try to help people avoid if they want to. So, one thing I argued for in the book that did come true was having more access to, Narcan pens or fentanyl test strips or ways for people to avoid dying. Um, in Canada, they have a safe supply system, and people can even use their drug of choice under medical supervision. And also, I think a really important thing in the United States is going to be having much easier access to medication assisted recovery. So people who do want to get clean, them being able to go on, methadone or Suboxone or something, trying to, because really, I think medication assisted recovery for most people is going to be their best shot if they really want it, to get off of the drugs. Um, so, I mean, I don't think that the libertarian needs to be indifferent to the overdose deaths or just being like, well, nothing we can do there. Um, but I think in some cases, yeah, like I think in some cases, people would rather be dead than sober. And like that sucks, but I don't think that there's much you can say to them.
Yeah, I feel like there are, I don't know, like two different type of concerns here, maybe like against libertarianism or with libertarianism, right? One is that you could have two equally libertarian societies, but have two very drastically different outcomes, right? Depending on just the culture and maybe like the ethos of the people, religiosity, right? The social connectedness, And so you could live in one country and think it's great, but then live in another one and think like it's terrible, right? And then you just kind of attribute these problems to just the political philosophy that's being implemented in that society. So I mean, I think
Yeah.
one response to that is like, well, maybe libertarianism or maybe this like rights-based approach is only appropriate for certain societies. In other societies, they need more of a paternalistic government.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think you're right about the first part, which is like one thing that earlier in my career as a political philosopher that I feel like I underestimated was I think I used to think that I overemphasized the value of institutions. And I used to think that a lot of outcomes were just going to be a result of public policy and institutions. And I thought that institutions and public policy could do more than they can. And I thought that the underlying choices of individuals within the population were going to be more responsive to institutional choices. I don't think that anymore. I do think that there's going to be it's really hard to change behavior through institutional change in a lot of these cases. That said, I don't think that we should think like, oh well, so some people are just like gonna like need more paternalism or they like need more structure, and so we should have more authoritarian institutions. Um, because I think everybody is an adult person who has their own life to lead, and they make their own trade-offs about risk. And yeah, I think some people are much more risk acceptant, and it's great to let them take those risks because those risks could pay off in really exciting ways. They can start new companies, or they could create interesting art or cool new music. But the price of living in a society with a lot of risk accepting people who are going to do all of those cool things and be really innovative and creative is like sometimes risk accepting people also make bad decisions and like this and it's like the curse is the gift and the gift is the curse. So, but everybody's an adult. I don't think that it's right for public officials to treat adults like their children. For one thing, because the people in the government are also people who are flawed and like who they're all like, I don't think we should trust doctors or regulators or people in Congress to assume that they're any better at making decisions than the rest of us are. Like they don't have any special powers. They've got all the problems we've got.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but for the individual who's struggling with addiction, I feel like that's a different case versus like the government as an institution, right? It's not like the government as an institution is struggling with addiction. If that were the case, then yeah, like their judgments would be, I guess, comparable. But I think people are seeing these regulators as almost kind of like a third party, right? It's kind of like if you are struggling with addiction, you're not approaching this scenario in maybe like the most clear-minded way, you know? And
Yeah.
sometimes they'll need some sort of third party person who kind of can see like who's a little more like distant from the issue and not necessarily as personally invested to kind of like analyze and kind of like influence the choice architecture, right? So that it kind of at least nudges you away from whatever the thing that you want to do that's bad for you is.
I know that people, it's like socially desirable for people to say, like, oh, I'm like weak willed, or like, I can't make this decision, or I'm not in a good position to make this decision. Because when people say that about themselves, what they're kind of saying is like, I don't think I should be able to be responsible for this decision, or I don't want people to blame me or to be disappointed in me. But I think that people, there's no view from nowhere. Like everybody's just making a decision based on the desires and beliefs that are floating around in their own head. And we shouldn't privilege one way of doing it over another just because it's more socially desirable or pro-social in this way. Um, so I think it's true that you will talk to people sometimes and they'll say like, "Oh, I wish that cigarettes were illegal." And they'll be like a smoker and they'll say that. And like, but you don't wish that cigarettes were illegal because you love cigarettes because you were buying cigarettes every week. And so like, but they want to say that because they want to kind of absolve themselves from responsibility for their own decision making. But I think that they are responsible for their decision making.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm. So what is the approach then, given a situation in which you have one particular issue that, if legalized, will lead to these negative consequences that
right.
nobody wants, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like where does the libertarian kind of have to kind of I don't know, accept some regulation or some paternalism, because it seems like there has to be somewhere, right? So let's say that we're talking about the legalization of drugs. You don't need prescriptions to access opioids or something, right? So let's say, okay, addiction is going to rise. Everything that comes from drug addiction is going to rise as well. Crime, violence, right? But of course, libertarians are against crime and violence, right? You can't be hurting other people. You can't be, stealing from them or destroying their property, right? So, what are we going to do then to address this problem? Because if you just have the criminal part, that comes after the harm has already taken place. You can't
Yeah.
really address you can't nip the problem in the bud.
Yeah. No, it's a really hard problem. Um, Yeah, I acknowledge that. And it I do feel the force of people saying like, well, if something's very highly correlated with the crime, then that might be a presumptive reason to just take it off the table. So people say that about guns, like nobody should have guns because many people do crime with guns. Um, but of course there's a lot of people that are like totally legitimate gun owners, and you wouldn't say to them like, oh, because someone else is gonna act wrongly, you can't have access to this thing that you really like hunting or something. And this was the argument for prohibition, which was very valid. Like, men were coming home and beating their wives and being horrible because of alcohol, and that was correct. And right now, a lot of crime is attributable to alcohol. A lot of violent crime that we see, um, or sexual assault, a lot of that, it's alcohol involved. But then there's a lot of people who are, like, very legitimate alcohol drinkers. And so the fact that something is kind of causally linked to crime, cars, similarly, um, or to violating people's rights, I just don't think that can be enough because making something illegal on those grounds would mean that you're subjecting the majority of the users who are not liable to be interfered with any kind of threats of criminal penalties. You're making all of those people subject to government coercion when they didn't do anything wrong. And it's like they are not fit for being subject to these penalties just because they're engaging in a activity that a minority of the users, when engaged with that activity, are gonna act more wrongly. You see what I mean? It's like, and so even then, like, so I do get it because I mean, I've been in places that have like a very large unhoused population where it's very clearly substance use disorder. And I hope that those people have been given access to medication assisted recovery and some kind of like path to not using anymore. I'm actually guessing that a lot of them probably have. And there's two things that are going on in those cases. One is like untreated severe mental illness and the fact that our like mental health infrastructure is totally broken in America. And so that's like one set of that population. And then I think another part of that population are people who they could kick, um, but where they are at that point in their life right now, they're just not ready to kick and they'd rather sleep on the street and still be using. And they judge that that decision is in their immediate interest and that that's like the best way that they can spend the next few months of their lives or whatever. And that it's like hard to hear. It's like it's hard to see those people and see them in that way. Um, Now, I mean, I really don't have a solution for the people who have severe untreated mental illness, and I think that is a lot of what you're seeing there with like substance users that are unhoused.
Mhm. Mhm.
And there's No one has a good answer to that. Like, no
Yeah.
one in philosophy has a good answer to that.
I want to explore this analogy that you're making with guns. Maybe there's one point where they're disanalogous. That's irrelevant here. So I think people who are more in favor of pharmaceutical regulation would say, well, look, like these doctors, they understand health better. They understand, and pharmacists, whatever, like they're experts, right? They know what these drugs are. They know what these drugs can do to you. They know what's appropriate for your particular condition, right? And so that's why they can act as a safeguard, right? Well, in the case of guns, it's not like the gun seller is going to be some sort of like, I mean, I guess they're like a gun expert, but I don't know if it's necessarily the type of expertise that you would necessarily like want,
Yeah.
like that could justify some sort of regulation, right? It's not like the person themselves doesn't understand how guns work, and so that's why we want them.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I feel like there's a disanalogy there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that drugs that have like really severe side effect profiles or high risks or even risk of addiction, that they should come with some kind of warning about available to people. And it's good to disclose all of the known risks just for like fraud reasons. Like you shouldn't lie to people about the thing you're selling them. I think some people know and they don't want to know, you know? I think that's so they'll say like, "Oh, I was never informed. Like I didn't know that that's how it," but like that's tough sometimes with certain but yeah, I think disclose it all. Tell people everything that's happening and make it available. If you want to talk to the pharmacist, you know, it could be over the counter, but if you want to talk to the pharmacist, have a person available who can answer questions about the product, you know, that's all good. Give people the information. The thing that I object to is when the access it would be restricted until a person who has all of the information agrees with your choice. Because then you don't really have the choice. And sometimes people will say, you know, "Oh, we need to check for competence." And it's a sort of catch 22 because the person's like, "Well, no one would ever consent to use this drug if they were competent." And so like you wanting to use this drug is just itself evidence that you were incompetent. And so it can't have a competence standard like that. It's impossible for a person to competently decide to make a decision that's going to be harmful to them. I think the bar for competence should be pretty low. It should be the same as the bar for competence with informed consent. And then it's like, yeah, the general decision index, some kind of basic means end reasoning and awareness of your circumstances, the ability to ask questions about it.
Yeah, I think maybe like cases that would make people sympathetic to the right to self-medicate are the people who are suffering from some sort of disease and there are these experimental treatments or something that they can't have access to or they don't
Oh,
have
yeah.
access to because maybe they're in some other country and they don't have them here, you know? I think those cases, I think you can draw a lot of sympathy, right? Because you feel for that person. Like this person is desperate, you know, they're dying, you know, like, and we feel like, you know, that people should have access to these experimental drugs if it can save their life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And those people, I think, have a real grievance against the FDA because I think that um, obstructionist regulations in those cases are the cause of death. Like if you know, you were bitten by a snake and I have the antivenom that can save your life. And then some third party says, wait a minute, Jess, before you can give him the antivenom, you have to wait 6 weeks for us to evaluate it and make sure that it's going to do what you say it's going to do. And in the meantime, you die. I don't think that the snake killed you. I think that that guy killed you. Like, that was what happened there. And so, for those people who have access to experimental investigational drugs, I think that they have rights of self-defense that are being violated by these laws. You're bringing up the much harder cases where it's like it's seemingly very clearly not in a person's medical interest for them to be taking really highly powered recreational drugs that are potentially gonna escalate and like lead them to, you know, make really, really harmful to self-destructive decisions. Those are the harder cases from my view. But yeah, I think that the right to access investigational drugs is and gaining steam. Like since I wrote Pharmaceutical Freedom, like you've had much more right to try, many more past access experimental drugs. There's much more of a kind of movement behind expediting access. I mean, it's not there yet, but there's been a lot of progress, which is good.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of how people are going to feel about your position is going to be informed by what they think about human nature. And just human beings in general, right? If you're more pessimistic and cynical, then you're gonna think, "Oh, no, like, you can't give people this right." I mean, like, people are uneducated, they're dumb, they're also misinformed, right? Because there's all this misinformation on the internet, and the internet also empowers people to form little, like, enclaves, and so like-minded people will just kind of, like, find other like-minded people, and they just kinda, like, spread this misinformation, right? It's like, "Oh, there are these I don't know, some bad stuff in the COVID vaccine, the little microchips or something. It's gonna make you magnetic, you know? Like, I remember talking with this one patient who, like, tested, like, I think he got a fridge magnet and tried to put it on his arm to see if it would stick, and he's like, "Yeah, it didn't stick." And I'm like, "Okay." You know?
Yeah.
But you have, like, these people out there, right?
Oh,
So,
yeah.
there was I think there was what was it? This patient, I think he didn't even believe in, like, Western medicine or something like that. I think it was his spouse who, like, kinda pushed him to come to the hospital, but he had some sort of I think it was an infection or something, and he wanted colloidal silver. He was like, I don't want your whatever medicine, I want colloidal silver," and apparently there's no scientific evidence that that is supposed to help a person with this condition, but that's what he wanted, you know?
Yeah.
And so you have these cases, like, all the time, and it's just like, if you're coming at it from that perspective, then you think freedom equals, like, danger, right?
Right.
It's self-harm, it's other harm, it's like, we're gonna live in a society of just, like, characteristic I don't know, like, I don't know. It's just it would
Yeah.
be a disaster.
I know. I feel the force of the objection, which is like, I might summarize it as like, have you met people?
Yeah.
And like, yeah, I've met people. Like, oof, it's a big internet out there. And like, yeah, I've met people. Like, people are, they think some wild stuff. Here's my counter. Have you met doctors? Or have you met public officials? Have you met lawmakers? And like, you'll be shocked to find out that they're also people. And so they have their own systems of biases and blind spots and things that they're doing that are just monstrous. And when, they're making these decisions, they're not necessarily deciding in the interest of a person's health any more than the person is. So people are very misguided about their own health, and they have a lot of wacky views sometimes, but health is only a small part of their lives, and they might be valuing other kinds of making different trade-offs than a doctor would. And also, a doctor sometimes is making decisions so focused on health or minimizing their own liability or minimizing their own sense of responsibility and guilt that that's also not necessarily in the patient's overall interest. And we should recognize that. And all of these same arguments would have applied back during the time of informed consent. And the doctrine of informed consent only emerged 100 years ago. And so we're pretty new to even having any kind of medical rights over our own bodies. And, 100 years ago, when doctors were debating how much authority to give patients about consenting to surgery or interventions during childbirth or refusing medical treatment, I think a lot of people back then were saying, but have you met people? And like, part of that was, I think, learned helplessness, but part of it was valid. Like, yeah, maybe some people are not great at making decisions, but it doesn't follow that impersonal regulator's perspective is privileged in some way.
Yeah, so in a sense, you don't really have faith in institutional progress in that sense, right? You almost put the individual's ability to do what's good for them on par with an institutional's ability to do what's good for them, or
Not
no.
necessarily. I mean, I have faith in institutions where it's like, I think it's great that drugs are tested with randomized controlled trials. I think that's like a good thing. I think evidence-based medicine is great. I think the more information we have about drugs, the better. I think that in general, people should listen to doctors, but I do think that there's enough cases where a doctor is wrong or a person disagrees, and there's systemic biases that are kind of explaining that wrongfulness, that we shouldn't just take that decision out of the hands of the patient. If we have a default about which person should have that authority, it shouldn't be the doctor or the regulator, it should be the patient. To give you an example of like some things I'm working on in the next year, one thing I'm working on is preventative medicine. And in the United States, there's a lot of colonoscopies, and people get kind of routine colonoscopies starting at around 45 years old, and it's a difficult procedure. There's a lot of prep work. You have to go under anesthesia for it. It's very expensive, and they don't really do it in Europe. They do a flex sig, set of full colonoscopy seems to be just as effective at screening for the most part. And all of this preventative screening seemingly has no impact on all-cause mortality. And they've done randomized control trials of, the colonoscopy assignment intervention. And it doesn't seem to, it reduces colon cancer incidence, but all-cause mortality, the thing that we really are going to care about, I'm not clear that it's extending people's lives on balance because there's real risks associated to it. But institutionally, there's a lot of pressure from public officials to say, get screened. We want to have a lot of prevention, kind of putting it on the patients to do it. Doctors reimburse and bill for it. Patients really want it. I don't know. Like, it's like, and if people want to get a colonoscopy, great, go for it. I think that's fine. But if you wanted to refuse a colonoscopy at 45, it would be so wrong for a doctor to force you to do it based on the limited evidence. But if you asked GI doctors, they'll all say, get the colonoscopy. Because from their perspective, they see all of these cases where they're catching colon cancer early and they feel like they're saving people's lives. And that's the meaning of their life. And they're not seeing, like, they're really discounting all of the people who are like stressed by the prep work, need to get somebody to drive them, can't afford to get the procedure, have to take off work, all this, like they don't bear any of those costs. And then
Mhm,
they see the people who get colon cancer and they didn't have a colonoscopy, and they see the people who caught it early and live. And so, like, they're just from a different perspective. And it's like not clear whose perspective is right. Like, I just don't know.
mhm. I think I remember one exception that you mentioned in the book is that you thought that there was justifiable regulation over what was it like antibiotics, right? Because if people take them too much, then they'll lead to the generation of antibiotic resistant bacteria.
Yeah, when I was writing that, it was around the time that there was an antibiotic resistant strand of syphilis that had emerged, I guess. And I was like pretty worried about that. My impression is that pharmaceutical companies have now been more capable of developing treatments that can overcome a lot of antibiotic resistance. And so if that's true, then I would rescind that. But yeah, I mean, there can be some kinds of like public goods, poisoning the well, externality type cases that if ever there were a case for regulation, it's going to be something like air pollution, and like there are ways in which pharmaceutical use can be similar to air pollution, where they're sort of polluting the commons.
Hmm, hmm. So then I guess this would be an issue for, I guess, anybody who wants regulation in some areas, but not in other areas, right? Which I
Yeah.
guess would be everybody, which is like where you would draw the line, right? So if
Yeah.
you're saying that, if antibiotic resistant, diseases and stuff is really an issue that we should regulate, but we shouldn't regulate something like opioids, even though they lead to like OD and stuff like that. There's going to be some like line that's drawn in the middle, where So is it going to be determined by the percent of the population that's being negatively affected? Like what are we even using to determine where that line is drawn?
Dude, this is such a like I really wish that I had an answer for you, and I wish anybody had an answer for you when it comes to how we think about rights and risk. But no, no one has a
Uh-huh.
there's there's no one in normative ethics that I can think of that has it figured out. Like if you're a consequentialist, there's weird stuff in decision making about like a decision theory about like agglomeration and like do we consider ex ante versus ex post risk, and like how do we add it up? How do we differentiate different actions, like sets of acts? Like how do we divide up how we even characterize the risk? Like what is probability? Like, and then if you're a rights theorist, it's like so vague. And like, how do you think about a person's entitlement to risk? And if it's like the modal robustness of their well being, does that mean that like you can harm somebody by putting them at risk, even if the risk never eventuates? Like, what? Like, and so, yeah, all moral theories are going to have a horrible time with this. My own view is that plausibly there's some kind of entitlement against being put at risk uh, along the spectrum of 0 to 100%.
Yeah. Somewhere between 0 and 100.
And it's gonna also, in some ways, that entitlement will, in some ways, be indexed to how significant the risk is along the spectrum of not noticeable to death. I'm like,
Somewhere in between these two
right? Yep.
extremes is
And
the
so with those
line.
parameters moving, there's some theory of rights that's
Yeah.
gonna like make sense. I don't think that the contractualist framework is a promising one with the pairwise comparison of claims to do. I don't think that's the way to go. But like, I don't know how we think. I don't know what people's rights against risk are. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, no one knows. If you find a philosopher on your podcast who has this answer figured out, like, send them my way because
Yeah, no, I'll definitely let you know.
that
So can you think
would
of
be
any
cool.
can you think of any other drug that you think would be an exception to your position? Like something other than antibiotics?
Um, I think maybe in the book, I don't know, it's like some people think that maybe like PCP or like cocaine-ish type, like drugs that make people like super more likely to be violent. Like sometimes people will say that where it's like the drug like turns you into a werewolf. And so you have to be like locked away, like the old stories of the werewolves or like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type thing. I think we know what that drug is, and that drug is alcohol. And so if the thing that you're worried about is a drug that's going to make people more likely to do violent crime, and you think that we should prohibit or regulate that drug based on that externality, like number one on your list should be alcohol. And we tried it and we weren't into it. And so that's why I'm a little reluctant to go down that road of like other drugs that are really highly associated with violent behavior. Is just,
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the principle and the argument, I think, I would agree with you. I would want consistency, right? And I feel like a lot of and people in favor of drug regulation or people who don't, who want to make marijuana illegal or keep it illegal, they don't really, I don't know. I haven't really encountered what I consider to be a good argument in terms of like why they wouldn't also be in favor of like alcohol regulation. Why should we ban alcohol? Like for some reason they're all okay with alcohol, probably because they drink it themselves, but then they're not okay with like weed. And it's like, but in terms of harm, like one is clearly worse, right? Alcohol is clearly worse. So there's a lack of consistency there. But just in terms of practicality, you may think, look, alcohol is already, it's we can't ban it. Okay,
right. The
it's all
THC
out there.
are the
It's just no way that we can practically do it. But something like these more danger, these like more rare drugs that are also more dangerous, like we can regulate those. They're not ubiquitous, and so
Yeah.
they're just taking a practical approach.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think like at the point that you are letting people use alcohol though, like why are you taking the more practical approach with these other drugs, which are because alcohol is like so highly associated with aggressive behavior. Um, so and I do think that I still believe, despite what I said earlier about Oregon, that some of the harms, like the crime associated with illegal drug use, is that it's in the black market. And that not just that it's like, it's illegal to use it and buy it, but that the kinds of people who you start interacting with, if you are buying drugs illegally, it just sort of has an association in virtue of being illegal. It's going to place you in association with people who have more of a tolerance for illegal behavior more generally and like other kinds of crime. And so making it legal, I think would, you know, it have criminogenic effects in some ways, but in other ways it could mitigate the criminogenic effects. Um, but yeah, like I see the pragmatic argument, but I'm like, at the point that you allow alcohol though, like by what is it literally just like we're just going to draw the line arbitrarily here because we just think that then I just have the same thing I have earlier, which was like that would just be restricting the liberty of a bunch of non-liable people who are actually not going to do any kind of crime because there's some chance that some number of other people would do different crimes because they were related to those drugs. I don't know.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, I hear you. It's a tough issue.
The alcohol thing, it's like at the point that we're allowing alcohol, which has a lot, and nicotine, which are both like nicotine's extremely addictive, and alcohol is like very highly correlated with suicide deaths, like people drinking themselves, alcohol related toxicity, also drunk driving, also violence. Like alcohol has all of these really bad effects. At the point that you allow alcohol, a lot of other drugs are going to be on the table. And then also at the point that we allow Tylenol, which was grandfathered in under all these regulations, Tylenol is like pretty dangerous. And so if you're allowing Tylenol without a prescription, which we do, like I think a lot of drugs that require prescriptions just by that standard of comparable risk and parity should just be moved over the counter. Like,
Yeah, yeah, there should be consistency. And I remember talking to one of my friends who's also a doctor. He's like, yeah, it's kind of hard to kind of give you an explanation of what the justification is for why these medications are like over the counter and these aren't, because he specifically brought up Tylenol. I was like, yeah, you could totally OD on Tylenol, but you can buy that anywhere. And I was like, yeah, I don't really know what the justification is. But yeah. No, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here again.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a fun conversation. I feel like with more distance from pharmaceutical freedom, I've become kind of more like wishy-washy and like, yeah, like those are good objections, man. Like, I don't know. Um, I still like believe the things I think, but yeah, it's just it's a question of trade-offs. Like I feel like all I can do is just raise the price of believing in the status quo, but you
Yeah.
make good objections. I
Yeah.
just that the price isn't worth paying. I think we should have pharmaceutical freedom because it's just worth it, but I do realize that there's a trade-off.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, how about this? We can always revisit this topic. But when did you publish that book? 2017?
Yeah,
All
about
right,
10.
so that's like like 8 years ago or something, almost
Yeah.
9 years ago. So
We'll
maybe
meet
like
back
in
up.
8 years into the future, we can revisit this topic and see, and discuss the changes in our society.
Yeah. I mean, so far I've been happy with the way that reform's been in the last 8 years, but um, so hopefully, for the most part, I think it's gone pretty well. So,
All
um,
right. Well, again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this
yeah,
conversation.
yeah. Have a good one. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.